I think like every good presentation, I'm supposed to begin with a story. And if you know me, I can't help but to talk about bicycles. Like some people who have sort of addictions to maybe shoes and purses, I have an addiction to bikes. I have way too many bikes. If any of you are cyclists, you know the theory of N+1. It's the number of bikes that you have. I want to begin this story because I had been bike racing for about 10, 12 years. And like every season, we would sort of go through the winter training in the Seattle rain, which was always so glorious, and then waiting for the first race of the season. And the first race of the season, everybody would come, and it was segmented by classes of racers, and I was sort of in that racing collection of like the category 3s. And so the first race of the season would be super jittery. There'd be sort of a misty in the air. This happened to be out in Sequim, Washington, which is the Olympic Peninsula. And then the race lets off. And I had been bike racing while also growing my career in commercial development. And so the race lets off. And in essence, we're kind of going down the road. We're about 5 miles down the road. And 2 women in front of me, their wheels touch. And the woman in front of me does what you never do in a bike race. Grabbed handfuls of brake. And I immediately smacked into her, went tumbling over, broke my collarbone, several ribs. But before all that happened, and before I could take the fresh breath of air as I was laying on the chip seal with a smashed helmet, I thought to myself, this is meant to happen to me. I'm going to learn something by it. And the fascinating thing about that is that in that moment of vision, if you will, that through that experience, through that toughness, through that harsh of slamming myself on the pavement, I had this vision that I was going to get something from this. And what interestingly that did for me is that I certainly had pain, but I didn't suffer. And it taught me that in the acceptance of it, the acceptance of that moment, I could have a lot of clarity about what was going to happen to me and really engage in sort of the world around me. I had a series of friends that surrounded me, brought me back to health, and I had this vision for that year that I was actually going to win one of my first races. I came back 6 weeks later, jumped into a 3-day stage bike race, and won one of the stages of the race. So I want to say that success is really about getting up one more time after you fall. And resilience is really the gift of having the opportunity to experience hard things. And certainly I don't have to talk about resilience to this group because clearly you all have the character and have gotten here and have stood up so many times. But to me, like resilience has certain vectors to it. And I believe those vectors are really about direction, about having vision for that direction, having drive, which is really the community and support around you, call it collaboration. It's also resourcefulness and the tenacity to continue to kind of drive through all of that. And then lastly, I would say the durability and the focus on well-being. And so why am I talking about resilience? Well, because we've just all gone through this thing called a pandemic. I guess some would argue that we're not through it yet. And certainly a big question has come around sort of the nature of work and workplace. And really what I want to talk about today is really driving organizational resilience through workplace, wherever that workplace might be. So before the pandemic, we were like Don Draper, right? And as we kind of move through the pandemic, we're kind of like now wearing stretchy, like Spock and Captain Kirk. But in all seriousness, the future was already here, and it just wasn't evenly distributed. And really what happened is we saw an acceleration of a lot of patterns that we saw before. I love to quote Esther Perel, because Esther Perel is one of my favorite podcasters and famous psychotherapists. And she said, a pandemic really accelerates the beginning and the end of all relationships. And if you think about it in your own lives, and that is the beginning and the end of your relationship with your city, with your work, with your workplace, the beginning and the end of the relationship with your spouse, with your family, with your loved ones, with your friends, all of that. And I would argue also with workplace. So the way we work, and this was actually some of the things I talked about pre-pandemic, was changing. In fact, we had elevated expectations. We wanted everything, everywhere, all the time. In fact, we'd order an Uber, it'd say 3 minutes, we'd cancel it. And mobility has become everything. In fact, the way in which we've shaped workforces are to really instill the fact that we are using mobile devices. And so that actually allowed a distributed workforce to already begin. It was distributing work from not only being within inside the office or the headquarters, but anywhere, everywhere you went. And culture became capital. In fact, the funniest thing that I saw is that new emerging companies would say, God, we just need to hold on to our culture. Whatever we do to the workplace, we need to hold on to the culture. And older legacy companies, we need to change our culture. So let's just get some new workspace and we'll change it. And the funny thing is that culture is really the software of the organization, and the workplace is really the hardware. And you can't just get new hardware to change the software, but they do have to be very compatible with each other. And so how we work and where we work matters, and this is really coming forward, as we come through the pandemic. And fundamentally, I would say talent is driving decisions for leaders. With the shortened workforces that we see now and that are out there, a lot of what talent is doing is driving the shots. They're calling the shots, as you say. And also, what's key in that is that that leaders really need talent density. And so we're seeing where they're talent dense and talent rich markets, leaders are still really drawn to those places for core key talent. And talent actually wants leadership proximity for growth and for the advancement of their career. And talent is opportunistic. I'm not moving to California because of taxes, said no Gen Z or millennial ever. And that's an important thing to know is like, a lot of the commentary coming out is like, well, no one's ever going to move there. And I think we're seeing some patterns that young people are moving for opportunities, and that's opportunities for dates. That's opportunities for advancement and growth in their career. And there's really not a line of sight on taxes or costs of that per se. Lastly is really this notion of, if it's work from home, you hear the work from anywhere. I would argue that people want to work from somewhere. They really want to work from somewhere. And that's really driving the need to really create an environment that actually is better than home at the workplace. So one of the things that we actually learned through the pandemic, and this was sort of the time of the pandemic, is that the whole benefits of work from home are what I would actually call living at work instead, is that new talent really never liked work from home because essentially you hear them now saying, my career is stunted. In fact, as we're hiring for analysts and positions that are sort of below 3 years and under, the number one reason why they're leaving their job is because their direct report is not going to be in the office. And they fear that they're not going to have advancement in their career. The C-suite, initially sort of didn't like the work from home, obviously, felt as though there wouldn't be the productivity. There's an amazing amount of productivity, right? Almost too much so at the early stages. And then I think there's this sort of notion about growth, which I'm going to talk about. And then lastly, I think working parents, it was a struggle all throughout, particularly when schools are closed. And so when we started to see technology companies come forward and say, you can work from home forever, because a lot of people were concerned. I think I started to talk about like Maslow's hierarchy here, and that they were really solving for safety. People didn't feel safe going into the office, didn't feel safe leaving home. And so to sort of calm people and trying to get them up to the higher orders of Maslow's pyramid here, which is really the creativity and productivity of work, you had to solve for these basic foundational elements to the worker. And if you think about it, the next level is once you solve for safety, you really have to begin to have social and achievement. And a lot of that, I think, the core leadership is realizing done in physical presence before you can get to the top part of that pyramid, which is really, I think, that self-actualization, the creativity and the innovation that's possible for organizations. But how do you do that, right? So the other thing is that we sort of hear, started to hear a lot of different sort of variations in the way that companies were responding. And I'm going to kind of do a gross generalization between margin-based businesses and growth-based businesses. And if we all sort of remember back to business school, the classic S-curve, right? And I've kind of had the S-curve and the adoption curve sort of placed here. But there's just this different phases of businesses, right? Like in terms of like you have R&D and your sales are nowhere. And as you start to grow into sort of product market fit and then go to market, right, you probably have more and more competition into your space because they sort of see the margins that you're getting. Well, margin-based businesses don't jump the innovation curve and create new businesses. Let's talk about like maybe the HPs and the Oracles of the world, right, who decide that, oh gosh, we need to move to Texas, we need to labor arbitrage, we need to cut our costs. These are margin-based businesses that started to use real estate as a way to sort of improve margins. And they were doing this before, they were doing this in open space plans without really sort of understanding the impact to the work to try and drive a level of efficiency in their cost structure. I think growth-based businesses, quite honestly, will jump to another curve, and what they need to do is to continue to innovate. And those companies are really trying to figure out how to bring people back in physical presence. But the problem is that the worker, there's this tension that's actually really forming between talent and leadership, because talent enjoyed this amazing amount of flexibility, this ability to drive their day, this belief that we could sort of continue to drive their work. And so then the question becomes, what job does the office perform, to use Clay Christensen's terminology? What are we hiring the office to do? And I like to think about things in offense and defense. And I think in work from home and when you sort of do work in isolation, it's good D. You can do everything you know how to do. If you want to go on the offense and you want to be on the growth game, it's really hard to play offense, to grow the business in isolation. You really need the collaboration, the connection with your teams and other people. And quite frankly, I haven't seen the technology available to really do offense in remote. So this is just sort of a quick summary, but you need sort of this huddle, this offense game, and that's really no better hardware right now than the physical office. Let's talk about the work and the worker, because that really shapes the workplace. And we saw some of the stats from the World Economic Forum in a prior presentation, but really we're seeing that most roles need to expand in work. In fact, new roles are being created, and that every majority of your workforce, in excess of your majority of your workforce, needs to get upskilled and retrained in order to be competitive. And what does this mean? It means that the workforce will become more flexible, more decentralized, and more remote, quite honestly. So what does this mean for the future of workplace? I like to think about the fact that so much of the way that we've talked and we've designed workplaces, in fact, many of the ways in which developers still build office buildings, it's almost sort of like we view people as machines and built in silos, and that people come into this building and they're a part of this stately corporation, these big office lobbies and these mausoleums that sort of be the ode to the corporation. But it's really based upon this fact that work needs to be efficient. And the funny thing is that today we are all kind of creating this knowledge base, this creative product. And everything I know about the creative process is not efficient. In fact, you don't want it to be efficient, you want it to be effective. And so I'm arguing for the fact that we need to not create efficient workplaces. We need to create effective workplaces. And really that's reshaping sort of the organizational thinking around metrics of productivity and to sort of create more environments that are not about machine age and hierarchical structures, but more about this agile, networked organization. So that means we got to drive humanity into the workplace. Because I do believe that those sort of like defensive moves in business, those things that require rote and memorization, that are repetitious tasks, are really the risk of the jobs that will actually go to AI. The stuff that is really right-brain creative thinking is really the stuff that requires humanity. And so there's this real need to drive humanity into the workplace. And I would argue that it hasn't really been there. And some of the leadership tactics that are being used or have been used in the past is really a sort of a push rather than a pull. And that push is really using fear tactics to push people into the office, rather what I call engaging FOMO. The fear of missing office. No, actually the fear of missing out. And so there are basically 4 things that we need for effective work. And there are 4 C's. And the first one is a place for concentration. A lot of people suffered from places of concentration in their own home. But also in the open plan environments, these are things that we also suffered from. We didn't really have places of concentration where you can concentrate and collect your thoughts and then bring them forward into sort of like, environments of work. The second thing is convenience. This is going to be super important for making work better than home. If you can sort of offer some things at the work environment that make life easy, all the life admin stuff that never really gets done. Convenience is a big thing that we need, at the office to make it effective. Thirdly, we need spaces for collaboration, places to get together with colleagues. This is, in the last sort of like real estate cycle, there's been lots of spaces created for collaboration, probably less so on the other. And the fourth thing I would tell you is we need places of community. It's a lot of reason why a lot of us travel is so we can see things outside of our own organization. And that aspect of community is that mingling with people and others outside of your existing organization. I would almost say there's like a 5th C, which is really about control. There's this notion about using a lot of technology that allows one to control their environment, whether it be sort of temperature, lighting, heating, all those things that really sort of promote well-being. So I also think that there's new layers that need to come to workplace. Not a lot of folks are talking about this, but we are internally at EQ. There needs to be this real activation of energy, particularly coming out of a pandemic. We really feel that we need to feel humanity. We need to feel a part of it. The second is there's an aspect of social impact. And there's a real opportunity for us as a larger organization of where we're creating ESG as an amenity. In fact, we have engagement with community groups and so forth where we are allowing our partner companies who reside inside our buildings to engage in some of the work that we're doing locally for under-resourced youth, particularly. And then thirdly, I think there's this notion about circle design. So much in commercial real estate is so much waste. A lot of people talk about sort of the fact that 40% of the world's carbon is really burnt in buildings. We talk about these buildings, and I want to grab the pitchforks and go after these buildings. Let's go after them and get them. And then I realized, no, it's actually humans. So we actually need to really empower humans to figure out how to shut off a light bulb and how to, make better decisions when they're in buildings. So lastly, for us, the return to office is really about sort of making dynamic plans. And particularly, I think, for every organization, it's really sort of having that notion of acceptance of what's happened. There's been a fairly sizable trauma for many people. That the needs for every individual are different. And you realize your organization is made up of individuals. And I do believe that the workplace, from all of this experience, has to be a place of eduployment, of education and employment. And thirdly, I think secondly, on observations, making observations in your own organization. For us, we felt like we never left work, right? In fact, it just amplified. So this whole return to work, we like to call it return to office, because it's not return to work, we never left. We left experiences and we left camaraderie. And then for us, the solutions are really about looking at performance over prescription, really getting rid of office vanity metrics are a key. And then focus on those outcomes over processes. Adam Grant talks a lot about that. And then lastly, on sort of outcomes, it's really about teaching your organization about hybrid, because hybrid is really a third work category that never existed. And it's quite unsure if it will work because there's remote and there's in-office. And I think a lot of organizations had flexibility for people to sort of address the needs of their life. And for us, we actually haven't mandated people come to the office. We actually left it from an agile perspective to the managers to actually develop team charters. And those team charters are really to foster a communication between managers and all of their people about how they'll make decisions. How will they grow? what's important to them, how they communicate, all of those kinds of things. And what it's really fostered is younger people saying, well, I'm not sure how I'm going to learn this model. And the mid-level people who said, I can always work from home, have suddenly realized that they have a responsibility to the younger people to come in and train. And so that whole dialogue has been really important. So the team charters have been developed, and they also are going to be dynamic documents we revisit for quite some time. What I want to end on is a quote by a child author poet, Aaron Van Buren, and I think it's sort of appropriate for where we are. And it's, I will not be a flower picked by beauty and left to die. I will be wild, difficult to find, and impossible to forget. So with that, I say, be resilient, my friends. Thank you.